In search of the truth about Daniel. We're going to talk today about some prophecies, the dating of the book of Daniel, and why the Jewish people demoted Daniel. Around the year 285 AD, Porphyry put forth a notion in his book called Against Christians that Daniel was written no earlier than 165 BC. He made this assertion based on Daniel 11:21, which he believed was a prophecy about Antiochus Epiphanes between September 171 BC and December 165 BC, that king desecrated the temple and severely persecuted Jews, just as portended over a 2,300-day time period in Daniel 8:13-14. Such a specific prophecy led Porphyry to determine that Daniel must have been written in hindsight, not in advance. Some scholars today have jumped on Daniel's bandwagon and Porphyry's bandwagon and made those similar claims. And we've seen that over the past couple of hundred years, but it wasn't so in the ancient times. Porphyry's book was actually burned in the 5th century and he was declared a heretic. So did Daniel dupe the Jews? Because that's essentially what Porphyry is saying. If you want to accept later dating, this 165, one would have to believe that the writer of Daniel was intentionally crafting a false narrative and trying to fool his audience into thinking he wrote the text centuries earlier. We would have to believe the book of Daniel was a forgery and literary fraud smuggled in at the last minute, hundreds of years after Josephus indicated the Jewish canon had closed. We would have to believe that some of the historical content of Daniel is inaccurate and the Jews who accepted it into canon were duped. Yet we have good reasons to doubt this later dating. One major reason is that Daniel's acceptance into the Jewish canon provides strong evidence of his authenticity and historicity. The Jews had strict regulations on the books accepted into the canon, and they rejected secondary, dubious, or heretical books such as Enoch, Tobit, Jubilees, Judith, and similar books for those reasons. Anderson says, and yet we are asked to believe that these men, the Sanhedrin, with their extremely strict views of inspiration and their intense reverence for their sacred writings, that these men, the most scrupulous and conservative church body the world has ever known, use their authority to smuggle into the sacred canon a book which, ex hypothesi, was a forgery, a literary fraud, a religious novel of recent date. The book of Daniel begins in 604 BC, which is 18 years prior to the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, when Daniel and several other young men in 1 to 4 were deported from Judah to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel ends 2 years after the 70 years of Jewish exile in 532 BC. The book is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, yet it contains some Babylonian, Persian, and Greek words. The Aramaic portion is in Daniel 2:4 to 7:28. The first 6 chapters detail historical records of this time period, while chapters 7 to 12 detail Daniel's visions. So primary arguments for this dating: 1, Daniel claimed himself to be the author of the text. 2, traditions in Judaism and Christianity suggest older dating. 3, if written in 165 BC, Jews wouldn't have given it enough time for canonization. Next one, the Mesopotamians had no fixed methods of dating prior to 311 BC when they adopted the Seleucid system. So they determined dates based on the reigning years of their rulers when important events took place, according to Mazzani in 2008. Mazzani notes that Daniel used the Mesopotamian method of dating, and he referenced Daniel 1:1, 21, 2:1, 7:1, 8:1, 9:1, and 10:1, and said datable events in Daniel can be precisely ascertained when correlated with the contemporary Babylonian and Persian king lists and other relevant chronological conventions. The languages are written in a way that is consistent with the ancient forms of languages in these centuries. They were not written in a way consistent with dating around 165 BC. We also have historical support for both the accuracy of Daniel's claims and the early dating. Wilson in 1997 said the Aramaic of Daniel aligns in orthography, syntax, and etymology with Egyptian papyri of the 5th century BC and of the Aramaic of the northern Semitic inscriptions of the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BC. Wilson notes that Daniel has a mixture of Hebrew, Persian, and Babylonian words and differs from the Aramaic of the Nabateans. The Nabateans also spoke Aramaic, yet this group of Arabs was not established until the 3rd century BC. Hofwatt in 2015 says numerous scholars have identified old Persian words that were no longer in use in the 2nd century BC. One example is the word Ashpenaz in 1:3, which was unknown in the 2nd century and translated as a personal name with an unknown meaning at that time in the Jewish scriptures, yet it meant innkeeper. Kitchen in 1965 said, the Persian words in Daniel are specifically Old Persian words. The recognized divisions of Persian language history within Iranian are Old down to circa 300 BC, Middle observable between 300 and 900 AD, and New from 900 AD to the present. Now, the fact that the Iranian element in Daniel is from Old Persian and not Middle indicates that the Aramaic of Daniel is, in this respect, pre-Hellenistic, drew on no Persian from after the fall of that empire, and not on any Middle Persian words and forms that might have penetrated Aramaic in Arsacid times, around 250 BC. Kitchen also adds, only 3 words of one class, music, are involved. Greek wares reached all over the ancient Near East from the 8th century BC onward. Greek mercenaries and artisans served the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Greek words occur in Imperial Aramaic at the end of the 5th century BC, and there is nothing to stop them appearing earlier. It is unjustifiable to hold that Greek words in Aramaic imply a date after 330 BC. Many Old Persian words, alongside hardly any Greek words in our text, suggest a date in the Persian age. A document of Hellenistic date with a penchant for loanwords should have taken them from Greek or Middle Persian. Hence, a 2nd century date cannot be based on 3 Greek words. A very late 6th century date is early enough for the body of Persian words. Between these dates, no greater precision is possible linguistically. Lau in 1999 says, Greek words are explainable since the famous Orientalist W.F. Albright demonstrated that Greek culture penetrated the ancient Near East long before the Neo-Babylonian period. Archer, 1998, adds, but since we now possess less than 1/10 of the significant Greek literature of the classical period, we lack sufficient data for timing the precise origin of any particular word or usage in the development of the Greek vocabulary. It should be carefully observed that these 3 words are names of musical instruments, and that such names have always circulated beyond national boundaries as the instruments themselves have become available to the foreign market. These 3 words were undoubtedly of Greek origin and circulated with their Greek names in Near Eastern markets, just as foreign musical terms have made their way into our own language, like the Italian piano or viola. Steinman, 2008, says, the best that can be said about the linguistic evidence is that it suggests that Daniel was not written before about 560 BC and not later than 300 BC. Lau adds, the bilingual composition of Ezra, Hebrew 1:1 to 4:6, Aramaic 4:7 to 6:18, Hebrew 6:19 to 7:11, Aramaic 7:12 to 26, and Hebrew 7:27 to 10:44 cannot be explained only on the basis of the presence of some Aramaic letters, because the Aramaic text often extends beyond these letters intended to be rendered in their original language, just as the book of Daniel. And the first official letter, the famous decree of Cyrus, is rendered in Hebrew. Moreover, the first change from Hebrew to Aramaic occurs in precisely the same literary manner. Compare with Ezra 4:6 to 7 to Daniel 2:4, which is a proof that the term in Daniel 2:4 cannot be considered a later insert to indicate a late redaction, say after the loss of the original language text. It is rather a mark of authenticity. Kitchen says, within Imperial Aramaic, it is tempting to classify this or that minor peculiarity as hinting that this or that document shows East or West connections, but by and large, this is still unconvincing. In biblical Aramaic, word order in sentences having finite verbs is quite different from normal Northwest Semitic language, which is verb, subject, etc. Instead, we find the subject commonly first with the verb at the end of the sentence, having the object more often before or after that. Subject, object, verb, or subject, verb, object. This stands in striking contrast to the Dead Sea Scrolls Genesis Apocryphon of about the 1st century BC and Targum of Job of the late 2nd century BC, both of them embarrassingly close in time to a supposedly 2nd century Daniel. But it agrees well with the word order of the Assur-Ostracon of the 7th century BC and with the freedom of order in the 5th century Aramaic papyri from Egypt. Josephus also pointed out some very interesting stuff relating to Daniel. He said, he's a Jewish historian who was born around the year 37 AD. He said, "It is true, our history hath been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but hath not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. And how firmly we have given credit to these books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as either to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it has become natural to all Jews immediately and from their very birth to esteem these books to contain divine doctrines and to persist in them, and if occasion, be willingly to die for them." Josephus also dated Daniel when he talked about Alexander the Great and how Alexander the Great, around 332 BC, recognized himself in the book of Daniel. And when the book of Daniel was showed to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the temple of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. Here's the mosaic of Daniel. There's more of Belshazzar, the writing on the wall. Burstein in 1978 says, even in its present fragmentary state, the Babylonica contains a number of surprising airs of simple fact, of which certainly the most flagrant is the statement that Nabopolassar ruled Egypt. Beyond revealing such slips, the fragments allow no doubt that Berosus offered only the most superficial explanations of the events he recorded and made no attempt to compensate for the biases of his sources. In a historian, such flaws would be damning, but then Berosus's purpose was not historical. It was apologetic. He intended that his book would change Greek ideas about Babylon, and this it signally failed to do. So the order of the kings goes like this. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 561, followed by evil Merodach from 561 to 560, Neriglissar from 560 to 556, Labashi Marduk in 556, Nabonidus in 556 to 538, Belshazzar, who was a co-regent with Nabonidus between 553 and 539, Darius the Mede between 538 and 536, and Cyrus the Great between 538 and 529. There was the Medo-Persian kingdom. Those two were the initial rulers. So here's the Nabonidus cylinder, which gave us some evidence for Nabonidus. McDowell and McDowell in 2017 said, there is indeed evidence that Daniel is rooted firmly within the historical milieu during which it presents itself as having been written. So now we'll just turn over to a few prophecies. And maybe it's because of these prophecies and their fulfillment that Jewish people decided to demote Daniel sometime after Christ. He at one point was considered by both Jesus and Josephus to be a prophet. Jesus called him a prophet, and so did Josephus. However, he in later books, later Jewish ancient texts, they demoted him and did not refer to him as a prophet, although they still referred to many of his contemporaries as prophets. In Daniel 2, we have the prediction of the 4 kingdoms. Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a statue with a gold head, Babylon, chest and arms of silver, Medo-Persia, of Daniel 8:20, legs of iron is Greece, and feet of iron and clay is Rome. The 4th kingdom would be a divided kingdom. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, while the Eastern Roman Empire collapsed in 1453. Just to make this clear, those kingdoms that I just mentioned weren't fully named by Daniel. However, that's what we have estimated in more recent times, and also what was estimated even in ancient times by people who lived through any of those kingdoms. So another thing that occurred was a rock was cut out and struck and destroyed the statue. Yet out of the rock emerged a huge mountain that filled the whole earth. This is, of course, Jesus. And Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And of course, Peter was martyred right around the Vatican, where the Vatican stands today. And Constantine had a basilica built right up on top of his tomb. And so just like Peter and Jesus had said, on this rock, he built his church. In Daniel 7, we also see the reference that got Jesus essentially crucified, okay? Because what happened was the Pharisees approached Jesus and they said to him, "Who are you? Are you the mighty one? Are you the son of the Most High?" Those sorts of things. And Jesus did a direct reference to this particular verse. He said, "I am." And of course, the words "I am" also signifies God, because God referred to himself as "I am" many times in the Old Testament. He says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the Mighty One." They knew exactly what that meant, to be given equal status to the Mighty One. And here's what says in Daniel 7. "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened." And then it continues a little while later. "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, or the Father, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." In Daniel 9, we see 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Here's what the angel Gabriel said to Daniel. "Know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 77s and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with the streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him." Of course, the final 7 is a reference towards the end times, but we have the earlier 69 groups of 7, and that refers to a period of time which is 483 years. Zechariah, Isaiah, and Daniel all relate in certain ways that are really interesting. Isaiah in 44:28, right around the year around 700 BC, named Cyrus as the king who would allow the Jews to return from exile. He actually named the king Cyrus. Jeremiah in 25:10-14 and 29:10-14, around 626 BC, predicted the captivity of the Jews would last for 70 years. Daniel 9 was written around 539 BC, when the Jews had been in exile for around 66 or 67 years. So Daniel knew that their time was going to come very soon. The decree of Cyrus went out. We're trying to figure out right now exactly when the decree to rebuild Jerusalem went out. We had 4 options. The decree of Cyrus, which is between 538 and 536 BC, was to rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem, and that's mentioned in 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra 1. The decree of Artaxerxes to Ezra is another option. This was done a little bit after that. The decree of Darius Hystaspes to reaffirm decree of Cyrus. This occurred around 521 BC. And finally, we have the period of the decree of Artaxerxes to Nehemiah to rebuild the Jerusalem walls. This occurred in 444 BC. Scholars have estimated, like Harold Hayner has estimated, that 444 BC is the key date. And if you look at 483 years following that date, using a 360-day Jewish calendar, you'll land right upon the year 33, which is the time when Jesus offered himself as the Paschal Lamb and was finally hailed as a Messiah in Jerusalem when he came out to fulfill Zechariah 9:9. This occurred on Monday of the Passion Week, when Jewish people would select their lamb that they were going to use in the following Passover. And of course, we know that Jesus was also crucified on the day when the lambs were also slaughtered, and that was on Friday of the Passion Week. And then we also know the wonderful stuff that came apart on Sunday that following weekend. Just as Daniel prophesied, the second temple, which Jesus had appeared in, and that was, of course, prophesied also by Malachi in 3:1, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans soon after Jesus's resurrection in 70 AD. So I will conclude right there. So I want to say, please like, please subscribe, please come again. I really appreciate that everyone's been here today. Thank you so much. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God.